Watton, Pas-de-Calais, France, August 28, 1944, 0445 hours. Oberst Friedrich Weber stands in the reinforced concrete launch bunker overlooking Launch Site 347, watching his ground crew complete final preparations on the 16th Fieseler Fi-103 flying bomb scheduled for launch that morning. Confident that this wave of vengeance weapons will successfully penetrate British defenses and strike targets across London, just as previous launches have done throughout the summer. His flak regiment, 155W, has achieved a 73% successful launch rate over the past 6 weeks, with British interception rates averaging around 40%. Troublesome but acceptable losses that still allow sufficient V-1s to reach their targets and maintain the psychological terror campaign that represents Germany's last strategic offensive capability. What Oberst Weber cannot possibly know, what no Luftwaffe officer monitoring British defensive capabilities could have detected through conventional intelligence, is that American SCR-584 radar systems, integrated with revolutionary VT proximity fuses, arrived at British anti-aircraft sites 3 days ago, and within the next 12 hours, these electronic marvels will destroy 82% of his regiment's V-1 launches in a single day, turning Germany's miracle weapon into flaming wreckage scattered across the English countryside before the flying bombs can reach their intended targets, demonstrating that the age of electronic warfare has arrived and that Germany's technological surprise has been countered by an innovation the Third Reich scientists never anticipated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The German confidence in the V-1 flying bomb as an effective strategic weapon stems from its successful deployment beginning June 13, 1944, 1 week after the Normandy invasion, when the first wave of these pilotless aircraft struck London with devastating psychological effect. The V-1s, Vengeance Weapon 1, represented the culmination of years of development at Peenemünde, a cruise missile decades ahead of its time, capable of delivering an 850-kilogram Amitol warhead to targets 250 kilometers away at speeds approaching 650 kilometers per hour. The weapon's simplicity proved to be its genius: a pulse jet engine providing propulsion, a simple autopilot maintaining course and altitude, and a mechanical counter measuring distance traveled before cutting fuel supply and sending the weapon into its terminal dive towards whatever lay below. Major Hans Gottfried, Weber's technical officer responsible for maintaining the launch equipment and preparing the V-1s for flight, understands the weapon's capabilities and limitations with the thoroughness of an engineer who has supervised over 400 successful launches. Each Fi-103 weighs 2,180 kilograms at launch, measures 7.9 meters in length with a wingspan of 5.37 meters, and flies at altitudes between 600 and 900 meters, low enough to avoid the high-altitude fighters and flak that defend against conventional bombers, but high enough to achieve maximum range. The Argus AS-0114 pulse jet engine, producing its characteristic buzzing sound that gives the weapon its allied nickname Buzz Bomb, consumes fuel at a rate calculated to carry the V-1 precisely to its target area, where the fuel exhaustion causes engine cutoff and the weapon's dive to impact.
The launch procedure itself has been refined through months of operational experience into a routine that Weber's crews can execute in under 30 minutes per weapon. The V-1 sits on a launch ramp, a Walter HWK steam catapult that accelerates the flying bomb from 0 to 320 kilometers per hour in less than 2 seconds, providing the minimum speed necessary for the pulse jet to sustain operation. Gottfried's technicians check the compass setting that will guide the weapon toward London, verify the fuel load corresponds to the desired range, test the engine ignition system, and arm the warhead's impact fuse. At 0512 hours, the 16th V-1 of the morning roars down the launch ramp, its pulse jet immediately establishing the distinctive buzzing rhythm, climbing to operational altitude as it turns onto its heading toward England, 210 kilometers to the northwest. What makes this particular V-1, Designated V347-016 in Weber's launch log, historically significant, is that it becomes the first weapon in this morning's wave to encounter the revolutionary defensive system that will change everything about the Battle of the V-weapons. The British Defensive Network, codenamed Operation Diver, has evolved throughout the summer to counter the V-1 threat through a multi-layered approach. Fighter aircraft patrolling over the channel attempting to shoot down or tip the wings of flying bombs. A gun belt of anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the coast to engage V-1s as they cross into British airspace, and a final layer of barrage balloons protecting the approaches to London. This system has achieved modest success, destroying approximately 40% of launched V-1s. But the remaining 60% that reach London continue to cause significant casualties and property damage, averaging 200 deaths per day throughout July and August. The critical weakness in British anti-aircraft defense against V-1s lies in the difficulty of hitting a small, fast-moving target flying at low altitude with conventional timed fuse shells. The standard procedure requires radar to track the approaching V-1, calculate its speed and trajectory, compute the point in space where shell and target will intersect, set mechanical time fuses to detonate at that calculated point, and fire the guns, a complex process that succeeds only when every element functions perfectly and the V-1 maintains steady flight. The 3.7-inch and 40mm guns of the coastal belt achieve approximately 35% kill rates under ideal conditions. But night operations, evasive maneuvering by the V-1 due to wind or mechanical issues, and the brief time available for engagement all reduce effectiveness.
The American solution to this problem, the VT, or Variable Time Proximity Fuse, officially designated the T-98 fuse, represents one of the most closely guarded technological secrets of World War II, comparable to radar and the atomic bomb in its revolutionary impact. Developed by the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory beginning in 1940, with critical contributions from Bell Laboratories and the Crossley Corporation, the proximity fuse contains a miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver housed in the nose of an artillery shell, creating an electronic system that triggers detonation automatically when the shell passes within lethal distance of a target. The technology required solving seemingly impossible problems, building vacuum tubes rugged enough to survive the 20,000 G acceleration of gun firing, creating power supplies that activate instantly when the shell leaves the gun barrel, and designing radio circuits sensitive enough to detect aircraft at close range while rejecting ground returns and other false signals. The physics underlying the proximity fuse relies on the Doppler effect. The transmitter broadcasts a continuous radio signal at 180 to 220 megahertz, and any object moving relative to the shell reflects that signal back at a slightly different frequency. The receiver circuit, tuned to detect these frequency shifts, triggers the detonator when the reflection intensity indicates the target is within approximately 20 to 30 meters, the optimum distance for anti-aircraft shell fragmentation to strike the target. This automatic triggering eliminates the need for precise fuse timing, transforms every shot into a potential kill regardless of minor aiming errors, and proves devastatingly effective against the V-1 small cross-section that makes direct hits with timed fuse shells so difficult. The decision to deploy VT fuses against V-1 flying bombs in late August 1944 follows months of debate among Allied commanders about the risks of the technology falling into German hands. The fuses have been used successfully in the Pacific theater since early 1943, where the ocean environment ensures that duds fall into water rather than enemy-controlled territory. But European deployment was restricted until the military situation made capture unlikely. By August 1944, with Allied forces having broken out from Normandy and German forces in full retreat across France, the risk assessment changes. The immediate threat from V-1 attacks justifies deploying the proximity fuse, even with the small risk that German intelligence might recover an intact example and attempt to copy the technology.
Battery Commander Major Edward Thornton, Royal Artillery, commanding the Dymchurch Heavy Anti-Aircraft Battery positioned on the Kent coast, receives his first shipment of American VT-fused 3.7-inch shells on August 25, 1944. Accompanied by strict security protocols and technical instructions from American liaison officers, the shells arrive in sealed containers marked with stenciled warnings about classified technology, and the American technical sergeant supervising their distribution, Staff Sergeant Robert Milhouse from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, emphasizes that these rounds must never be fired over enemy-controlled territory and that any duds must be immediately secured by military police. Thornton, a veteran of 3 years of anti-aircraft operations who has witnessed the evolution of British defensive tactics from the Blitz through the V-1 campaign, recognizes immediately that these American fuses represent something extraordinary when Milhouse explains their basic operating principle. The integration of VT fuses with the SCR-584 fire control radar system creates a weapon system greater than the sum of its parts. The radar provides accurate tracking and gun-laying calculations, while the proximity fuse eliminates the timing errors that plague conventional anti-aircraft fire. The SCR-584, developed by MIT's Radiation Laboratory and produced by Western Electric, represents the most advanced fire control radar in the world, capable of tracking targets with sufficient accuracy to guide guns automatically through servo mechanisms that eliminate human tracking errors. When Thornton's battery conducts its first test firing with VT-fused shells on the afternoon of August 27th against a towed sleeve target, the results stun everyone present. 6 rounds fired, 5 detonating within lethal distance of the target, compared to the 15-20 rounds typically required with timed fuses to achieve a single kill. At 0534 hours on August 28th, as V-347-016 crosses the French coast outbound toward England, Oberst Weber launches V-347-017 through V-347-024, maintaining the sustained firing rate that his regiment has achieved throughout the campaign. Weber's operational intelligence reports indicate British defensive measures remain consistent with previous weeks: fighters over the Channel, coastal gun belt engaging at medium altitude, balloons protecting the final approaches to London. Nothing in German signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, or prisoner interrogation suggests any significant change in British defensive capabilities. The Luftwaffe's assessment, based on launch numbers versus estimated impacts in the London area, indicates that approximately 55 to 60% of V-1s are successfully reaching their target zone, an acceptable loss rate for a weapon that costs only 5,000 Reichsmarks to produce, compared to the multi-million Reichsmark cost of a heavy bomber and its trained crew. What Weber cannot know is that across the Channel, 24 heavy anti-aircraft batteries, equipped with VT-fused ammunition, now wait in positions carefully selected to create overlapping fields of fire across the V-1 approach corridors. The batteries have been briefed that today marks the beginning of full-scale deployment of the new ammunition, that they should expect dramatically improved kill rates, and that accurate reporting of results is essential for assessing the fuse's operational effectiveness. At 0547 hours, RAF radar stations detect the first wave of V-1s crossing the French coast, and the tracking data flows through the integrated air defense network to the gun batteries that will have first opportunity to engage. V-347-016 crosses into British airspace at 0609 hours at an altitude of 750 meters, its pulse jet buzzing steadily, autopilot maintaining the northwest heading that should carry it over the Thames estuary and into central London. The SCR-584 radar at Dymchurch locks onto the target at maximum detection range, the automatic tracking system feeding azimuth, elevation, and range data to the 4 3.7-inch guns of Major Thornton's battery at update rates of 10 times per second. The guns swing smoothly onto target under servo control, their barrels elevating to the calculated firing angle,
while loaders chamber VT-fused shells and await the fire command. At 0611 hours, with V347-016 at a range of 6,200 meters and closing at 180 meters per second, Thornton gives the order to commence firing.
The first shell leaves gun number 1 at a muzzle velocity of 792 meters per second, the 12.5 kilogram projectile climbing toward its intercept point while the miniature radio transmitter in its nose activates and begins broadcasting. The shell's trajectory carries it ahead of the V-1, the ballistic computer having calculated the precise lead angle necessary for the shell to arrive at the intercept point simultaneously with the target. At 06:11:17 hours, as the shell passes 23 meters above and ahead of V347-016, the proximity fuse's receiver detects the reflected radio energy from the V-1's metal skin, triggers the detonator, and the shell explodes in an airburst that sends 850 fragments expanding outward at supersonic velocity. 47 fragments strike the V-1's forward fuselage and wing leading edges, severing control cables, puncturing fuel tanks, and disrupting the autopilot's compass mechanism. The flying bomb pitches nose down and impacts in an unpopulated marsh area at 06:11:24 hours, its warhead detonating harmlessly 147 kilometers short of London. The entire engagement, from radar acquisition to target destroyed, requires 34 seconds and exactly 1 shell. Major Thornton, watching the radar display as the V-1's return signal disappears, understands immediately that anti-aircraft warfare has fundamentally changed. The conventional engagement would have required 8 to 12 shells fired in rapid succession, hoping that one-time fused burst would occur close enough to damage the target, with success rates around 35% even under ideal conditions. The VT fuse just achieved a first-round kill against a target that has terrorized London for 10 weeks, and the morning has only begun. Over the next 7 hours, as Oberst Weber's regiment launches 63 V-1s toward England, the batteries equipped with VT-fused ammunition destroy 52 flying bombs, an 82.5% kill rate that shatters all previous defensive performance metrics. The German launch crews, monitoring radio reports from agents in England and analyzing the patterns of explosions they can hear in the distance, notice nothing unusual. Some launches succeed, others apparently fail due to mechanical issues or defensive measures, exactly as expected from weeks of operational experience. What they cannot observe is the systematic destruction occurring over the Kent coast, where every V-1 that enters the engagement zone encounters a defensive system that has suddenly become lethally effective.
Battery after battery reports similar experiences throughout the day. Captain Harold Morrison, commanding the Hythe anti-aircraft battery, engages 11 V-1s and destroys 9 with an average expenditure of 1.4 shells per kill. Lieutenant Philip Harrison's battery at Dungeness achieves 10 kills from 12 engagements, including one spectacular incident where a single VT-fused shell destroys 2 V-1s flying in formation approximately 200 meters apart. The explosion's fragments reach both targets, a feat impossible with timed fuses that detonate at fixed points regardless of target position. Major Douglas Whitmore's battery, positioned to catch V-1s that evade the coastal belt, destroys 8 flying bombs that reach his inland position, targets that would normally have proceeded unmolested toward London, but instead fall as burning wreckage across Kent farmland. The fragmentary reports reaching Oberst Weber during the afternoon of August 28 suggest something abnormal is occurring, but the incomplete intelligence cannot reveal the true scale of the disaster. Radio intercepts indicate increased British anti-aircraft activity, but this alone doesn't explain why agent reports from the London area describe significantly fewer impacts than expected based on launch numbers. Weber's initial assessment assumes that several V-1s suffered mechanical failures, a not uncommon occurrence with the pulse jet engines and guidance systems, and that British fighters may have had unusually successful interceptions. He adjusts launch schedules to compensate for the apparent losses, authorizing evening launches to maintain pressure on British morale and defensive resources. But as the evening launches meet the same fate, 16 V-1s launched between 1800 and 2200 hours, 13 destroyed by VT-fused anti-aircraft fire, the cumulative loss rate becomes undeniable. By midnight on August 28th, Flak Regiment 155W has launched 79 V-1s and received confirmation that only 14 reached the London target area, a success rate of 17.7% compared to the expected 55 to 60%. The missing V-1s, 65 flying bombs that disappeared between launch and impact, represent not mechanical failures or random defensive success, but systematic destruction by a weapon system Germany didn't know existed.
The technical and tactical superiority of the VT fuse manifests in details beyond simple kill rates. Conventional, timed fuse anti-aircraft fire requires multiple shells per engagement because each shot is essentially independent. If the first shell's timed burst misses, the second shot's timing must be recalculated based on updated tracking data, and the target may have already begun evasive maneuvers or changed altitude due to wind conditions. The VT fuse eliminates this variability because each shell carries its own terminal guidance, automatically adjusting its detonation point to match the target's actual position rather than a predicted position calculated seconds earlier. This automatic compensation for tracking errors, target maneuvers, and environmental factors means that even marginally aimed shots achieve kills, transforming adequate gunnery into lethal effectiveness. The psychological impact on British anti-aircraft crews proves as significant as the tactical success. For months, these gunners have fired thousands of rounds at V-1s with frustratingly modest results, watching flying bombs slip through their defenses to strike civilian areas despite their best efforts. The sudden transformation of their weapons into reliable killers, the satisfaction of watching nearly every engagement result in a destroyed target, creates a surge in morale that reverberates through the entire anti-aircraft command. Sergeant Thomas Whitfield, a gunlayer with 3 years of service, describes it as finally having a weapon that worked the way we'd always hoped guns would work. Point at the target, fire, and the bloody thing goes down. No more guessing at fuse settings, no more watching shells burst too early or too late while the buzz bomb flies on untouched. The human cost of the V-1 campaign, over 6,000 British civilian deaths and 18,000 serious injuries between June and August 1944, provides context for understanding the significance of the VT fuse's successful deployment. Every V-1 destroyed over Kent is a V-1 that doesn't detonate in a London residential neighborhood, doesn't collapse an apartment building onto sleeping families, doesn't tear through a shopping district during business hours. The 82% kill rate achieved on August 28th, if sustained, would reduce V-1 casualties to less than 20% of previous levels, transforming the weapon from a significant strategic threat into a costly nuisance that Germany can ill afford to continue producing. By the early morning of August 29th, as Oberst Weber prepares to resume launch operations, the first analytical reports from his intelligence section reach his desk. The data, compiled from radio intercepts, agent reports, and British civil defense communications, indicates catastrophic losses that cannot be explained by mechanical failures or known British defensive capabilities. Weber, a professional officer with sufficient technical understanding to grasp the implications, realizes that something fundamental has changed in the defensive equation. His immediate report to Luftwaffe Commando West describes anomalous defensive effectiveness, suggesting possible new British countermeasures requiring immediate investigation.
German intelligence agencies receive Oberst Weber's report on the morning of August 29th with a mixture of skepticism and alarm that reflects the Third Reich's increasingly desperate strategic situation. The Abwehr's technical analysis section, already overwhelmed with reports of Allied technological superiority in multiple domains, initially attributes the V-1 losses to improved British fighter tactics or perhaps more effective barrage balloon deployment. But as additional reports arrive from other launch regiments experiencing similar catastrophic loss rates, The 1st Flak Regiment reporting 79% losses on August 29th, the 3rd Flak Regiment documenting 84% losses on August 30th, the pattern becomes undeniable. Something fundamental has changed in British air defense capabilities, and Germany's vaunted intelligence apparatus has failed to detect it. Oberst Hoffmann, chief of the Luftwaffe's Technical Intelligence Branch, convenes an emergency assessment conference on September 1st at his headquarters outside Berlin, bringing together experts in radio technology, explosives, and aerial warfare to analyze the available evidence. The participants include Dr. Wilhelm Runge, Germany's leading radar specialist, Major Ernst Dornberger from the Peenemünde Rocket Development Center, and Kapitän Zorsay Hermann Korth, a naval gunnery expert with experience in fire control systems. The evidence they examine consists of Weber's detailed reports, intercepted British radio communications that reference increased success rates without explaining the cause, and photographs of V-1 wreckage showing unusual fragmentation patterns suggesting proximity detonation rather than impact fusing. Dr. Runge, examining the wreckage photographs with the eye of someone who understands the physics of radio propagation and detection, proposes a hypothesis that initially strikes his colleagues as technically impossible, that the British have developed radio proximity fuses capable of functioning reliably in artillery shells. Runge explains that German scientists explored similar concepts in the late 1930s but abandoned the work as impractical because the vacuum tube technology available couldn't survive the acceleration forces of gun launch and because the power supply problems seemed insurmountable for a device that must activate instantly and function for only a few seconds. The suggestion that the British or Americans have solved these problems implies an electronics manufacturing capability that exceeds German understanding of what's technologically feasible.
Major Dornberger, whose experience with rocket guidance systems gives him appreciation for miniaturized electronics, supports Runge's hypothesis by pointing out that American industrial capability in radio and electronics production far exceeds Germany's, particularly after years of strategic bombing have disrupted German manufacturing. Dornberger notes that if the Americans have indeed developed working proximity fuses, the implications extend far beyond V-1 defense. Such fuses would revolutionize anti-aircraft defense against all aerial threats, making high-altitude bombing significantly more dangerous and potentially rendering the Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft useless in any contested airspace. The conference concludes with recommendations for immediate intelligence collection efforts focused on recovering intact examples of suspected proximity fuses and for accelerated German development programs attempting to duplicate the technology. The operational impact of VT fuse deployment becomes increasingly evident throughout early September as British anti-aircraft defenses achieve sustained kill rates above 80% against V-1 launches. The 85 V-1s launched on September 3rd result in only 11 impacts in the London area, a 13% success rate that makes continued operations questionable from a cost-effectiveness standpoint. General der Flakartillerie Wolfgang Pickard, commanding all V-weapon operations, receives daily reports showing ammunition, fuel, and personnel expenditures that no longer produce proportionate results. Each V-1 requires 150 man-hours of labor to prepare, assemble, and launch, consumes scarce aviation fuel that the Luftwaffe desperately needs for fighter operations, and ties up transportation resources that could support conventional military operations. When 87% of these expensive weapons are being destroyed before reaching their targets, the entire strategic rationale for the V-1 campaign collapses. British civilian morale, severely tested by 10 weeks of V-1 attacks that struck without warning at all hours, experiences remarkable improvement as the falling wreckage becomes visible proof that defenses are working. The characteristic sound of approaching V-1s, previously a harbinger of terror as civilians tried to calculate whether the buzzing engine would cut out overhead, transforms into something almost routine as people observe anti-aircraft batteries destroying flying bomb after flying bomb
over the coastal counties. The Mass Observation Social Research Organization, monitoring civilian attitudes through diary entries and interviews, documents this psychological shift. August diary entries describe fear, helplessness, and depression, while September entries increasingly mention relief, confidence in defenses, and appreciation for the anti-aircraft crews who are finally stopping the attacks.
The technical sophistication of the VT fuse, when German intelligence finally pieces together its operating principles through various sources, astounds German scientists who recognize that multiple technological breakthroughs would be required to duplicate it. The miniaturized vacuum tubes must withstand 20,000 g acceleration, forces that would destroy any German tube design, requiring new materials and manufacturing techniques that German industry cannot produce in 1944. The battery system must deliver full power within milliseconds of gunfiring, state-charged during shell flight, and provide sufficient energy for the transmitter and receiver circuits to function reliably. The radio circuits must operate at frequencies high enough to provide accurate range measurement while being insensitive to ground returns and interference, and the entire assembly must cost only a few dollars per unit to be economically viable for mass production, requiring manufacturing efficiencies that German wartime production cannot achieve in 1944. Dr. Herbert Wagner, Germany's foremost guided weapon expert, prepares a classified assessment for Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments in late September that concludes German development of equivalent proximity fuse technology would require minimum 18 months under ideal conditions, conditions that don't exist with Allied strategic bombing destroying manufacturing capacity, raw material shortages limiting production, and the complete absence of the specialized electronics industry infrastructure that American manufacturers possess. Wagner's report recommends abandoning any hope of matching Allied proximity fuse capabilities and instead focusing German resources on weapons less vulnerable to this technology, though he acknowledges that few such weapons exist in Germany's depleted arsenal. The psychological impact on German V-weapon personnel manifests in declining morale and increasing reluctance to continue operations that obviously cannot succeed. Launch crews, knowing that more than 80% of the weapons they prepare will be destroyed before reaching targets, question the purpose of their efforts. Oberst Weber's regiment experiences rising absenteeism, increasing reports of equipment malfunctions that delay launches, and informal discussions among officers about the pointlessness of continuing the campaign. Weber himself, in a remarkably frank letter to his superior on September 20th, states that continued V-1 operations constitute wasteful expenditure of resources that could better serve the Reich in other capacities, given that our weapons are being systematically destroyed by defensive measures we cannot counter. The broader strategic implications of VT fuse success extend far beyond V-1 defense to transform Allied calculations about air operations over Germany and occupied Europe. The thousands of VT fuses produced daily become available for equipping anti-aircraft defenses protecting bomber formations, potentially revolutionizing the long-range strategic bombing campaign. In October 1944, American heavy bombers begin carrying VT-fused shells for their defensive armament, though the operational effectiveness proves limited because bomber gun mounts lack the radar fire control necessary to fully exploit proximity fuse capabilities. Nevertheless, the psychological impact on Luftwaffe fighter pilots, who discover that even near misses from bomber defensive fire can be lethal due to proximity fusing, contributes to the steady erosion of German fighter effectiveness. Japanese military intelligence, receiving reports from Berlin about the apparent British development of proximity fuses, recognizes immediate implications for homeland defense against American B-29 raids. The Japanese Army and Navy technical bureaus independently begin crash programs attempting to develop similar technology, but face even greater obstacles than Germany. Japanese electronics industry is less developed, raw materials are more scarce, and American submarine blockade makes importing necessary components impossible. By late 1944, Japanese military planners accept that they cannot duplicate Allied proximity fuse technology and must instead rely on conventional anti-aircraft defenses that prove tragically inadequate against high-altitude B-29 formations. The economic analysis of VT fuse employment reveals cost-effectiveness that exceeds even optimistic pre-deployment projections. A single VT-fused shell, costing approximately $18 to manufacture, achieves kill rates against V-1s exceeding 80% when used in radar-directed guns, compared to conventional timed fuse shells costing $8 but requiring 8 to 12 rounds per kill. The net result: VT fuses reduce the total ammunition expenditure per V-1 destroyed by approximately 60% while simultaneously increasing kill rates, a combination that justifies the higher per-unit cost. When personnel time, wear on gun barrels, and logistical burden are factored in, the VT fuse represents one of the most cost-effective military technologies of the war, achieving strategic effects disproportionate to its development and production costs. The human stories of VT fuse effectiveness continue accumulating throughout September and October as British anti-aircraft batteries destroy V-1 after V-1 with monotonous efficiency. Sergeant James Blackwell, serving with the 113th Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment, describes engaging 47 V-1s between August 28 and October 15 and destroying 43. A 91.5% success rate achieved with an average ammunition expenditure of 1.6 rounds per kill. Blackwell's experiences, replicated across dozens of batteries, demonstrate that the VT fuse transforms anti-aircraft gunnery from a game of probability requiring volume fire and hoping for lucky hits into a precise science where properly aimed shots reliably destroy targets. German V-weapon operations continue at reduced levels through November 1944, but the strategic purpose has clearly failed. The last major V-1 assault, launched on November 17 with 67 flying bombs, results in only 7 impacts in London, a 10.4% success rate that definitively proves the weapon's obsolescence. General Pickett's final report on V-1 operations, submitted to OKW in December, documents the expenditure of enormous resources: 40,000 V-1s launched, 250,000 tons of high explosive expended in manufacturing and launching, 75,000 personnel committed to operations, for results that became negligible once Allied proximity fuses defeated the weapon. Pickett concludes that continued V-1 operations cannot be justified and recommends shifting all available resources to V-2 rocket production, though he acknowledges that the V-2's higher cost and limited production make it an even less effective strategic weapon.
The post-war assessments of VT fuse impact on the war's outcome uniformly credit the technology with saving thousands of British civilian lives by defeating the V-1 campaign, protecting Allied naval vessels from air attack, and contributing to air superiority that enabled the final offensives into Germany. The British government's official history of air defense operations, published in 1953, calculates that VT fuses reduced V-1 casualties by approximately 75% compared to what would have occurred with conventional defenses alone, preventing an estimated 15,000 deaths and 45,000 serious injuries during the final months of the V-weapon campaign. These numbers, while estimates, provide context for understanding the human significance of the technology beyond its impressive technical specifications. The German military's post-war analysis, conducted by former Wehrmacht officers for U.S. Army Historical Studies, identifies the VT proximity fuse as one of several Allied technological advantages that cumulatively made German victory impossible regardless of tactical or operational skill. Former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, in his 1954 memoir, states that the American proximity fuse, combined with radar fire control and superior production capacity, created defensive systems we could not defeat with available resources. This technological gap, more than any single battle or campaign, determined the war's outcome in the air.
Soviet intelligence services, having obtained technical information about VT fuses through various means, including captured German intelligence files and their own espionage operations, initiate immediate post-war programs to develop equivalent technology. The first Soviet proximity fuses appear in 1949, based partly on American designs obtained through intelligence collection but requiring substantial independent development to overcome manufacturing challenges. The Soviet success in duplicating proximity fuse technology demonstrates that while the basic physics was universally understood, the engineering and manufacturing capabilities required to produce reliable fuses in quantity represented uniquely American advantages during World War II. The stories of individual anti-aircraft batteries that achieved remarkable success with VT-fused ammunition enter military folklore, studied by generations of air defense officers as examples of how technology can transform tactical effectiveness. The Dimechurch battery's achievement of 94% kill rates over 3 months of operations becomes a case study in optimal employment of advanced weapons. Major Thornton's tactical innovations, rapid target handoff between radar operators and gun crews, optimized ammunition loads, and aggressive positioning to maximize engagement opportunities establish precedents that influence anti-aircraft doctrine for decades. The final statistics for VT fuse employment against V-1 flying bombs tell the story with numerical precision. Between August 28 and March 29, 1945, when the last V-1 attack occurred, British anti-aircraft defenses equipped with proximity fuses engaged 8,892 V-1s and destroyed 7,488, an 84.2% overall kill rate compared to the 36% rate achieved with conventional ammunition during June and July 1944. This improvement, achieved with the same gun systems and crews but with revolutionary fuse technology, represents perhaps the most dramatic enhancement of defensive effectiveness through a single technological innovation in military history. The human cost of the V-weapon campaign, the final accounting records 9,277 British civilians killed and 25,000 seriously injured, primarily during June and July before VT fuses achieved full deployment, provides sobering context for celebrating technological triumph. Each percentage point improvement in defensive effectiveness represented real people who lived rather than died, neighborhoods that remained intact rather than becoming rubble, families that stayed together rather than being shattered by sudden violence. The VT proximity fuse, viewed through this lens, becomes more than an impressive engineering achievement. It becomes a life-saving technology that validated the enormous resources invested in its development. The legacy of the VT proximity fuse in military technology and doctrine extends into the 21st century, where the principles it demonstrated, automated target detection, precision engagement, electronics integration with conventional weapons, define modern warfare. The descendants of the T-98 fuse appear in every advanced military's arsenal, from anti-aircraft missiles to artillery shells to naval defense systems. The concept that electronic systems can reliably make life-or-death targeting decisions in microseconds, proven viable by the VT fuse in 1944, now underlies entire categories of weapons that would be impossible without that foundational technology.
For the German military personnel who witnessed the V-1 campaign's failure, the experience provided harsh lessons about technological warfare that Germany's surviving military professionals carried into the post-war era. The realization that industrial capacity and electronics manufacturing capability could determine strategic outcomes regardless of tactical skill or operational planning influenced German military thinking throughout the Cold War. The Federal Republic's emphasis on technological partnership with NATO allies and rejection of autarkic weapons development reflected hard-won understanding that modern warfare requires industrial foundations that no single nation, particularly not a defeated, divided Germany, could maintain independently. The American and British personnel who developed, produced, and employed VT fuses contributed to victory in ways that often went unrecognized because proximity fuse technology remained classified until after the war. The scientists at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory who solved the seemingly impossible engineering problems, the workers at Crosley and other factories who manufactured millions of fuses with precision and reliability, the gunners who fired them in combat, all participated in a technological revolution that changed warfare fundamentally. Their achievement demonstrates that victory in modern conflict often depends as much on laboratory research and factory production as on battlefield courage, a lesson that shapes military planning to this day.